As the first YWCA in the nation, YWBoston has been at the forefront of advancing equity for over 150 years. Through our DEI services, InclusionBoston and LeadBoston, as well as our advocacy work and FIRE initiative, we help individuals and organizations change policies, practices, attitudes, and behaviors with a goal of creating more inclusive environments so that women, people of color, and especially women of color can thrive at all levels. During this pandemic, we've been helping organizations strengthen social connections to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion in the virtual space, as well as to think about how they can ensure that intentionality when they go back to their own in-workplace environments. I am thrilled that so many of you have joined us this afternoon or this morning for becoming part of the solution. Today, we will learn how we can all better commit to addressing systemic racism. I am joined by Dr. Robert Livingston, author, lecturer of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and consultant for a number of Fortune 500 companies. YWBoston first welcomed Dr. Livingston at our fall 2019 Elevating Lives event, entitled Understanding What You Can Do to Promote Racial Equity. His presentation and our discussion deepened our audience's perspective on racial equity and led to a very engaging conversation. And I will share that I think for those that don't know Robert, I think you will be thrilled with how he's able to use data, examples from his own personal and work experience, as well as parables to really illustrate the examples and the way to create change in organizations. With all the positive feedback we received, we're thrilled to have the opportunity to have Dr. Livingston back with us today. We're going to be talking a lot about his new book, which was just released on February 2nd, The Conversation: How Seeking and Speaking the Truth About Racism Can Radically Transform Individuals and Organizations. And it addresses three main questions. What is racism? Why should everyone be concerned about it? And what can we do to eradicate it? As his book lays out, the difference between a solvable problem and a solved problem is knowledge, investment, and determination. He recognizes that systemic racism is a solvable problem and breaks down the necessary action steps to one day considering it a solved problem. He stresses the importance of conversation throughout each step of one's action planning, hence the title. And as we stress on our own programs at YWBoston, facilitating conversations between diverse groups of people will inform our understanding of racial inequity and equip us to better eliminate it. Especially now, I find this breakdown of action planning useful. Last year, we saw an incredible number of individuals and organizations supporting Black Lives Matter. And I will tell you, our phone was off the hook with organizations eager to do something and do something now. And the interest is there. And the question is now, how do we follow through? Already, we are seeing the momentum towards changing the face of equity changing, right? We see people now saying, I'm having ally fatigue. This work is hard. And so we need to figure out how do we continue to engage and not step back to do this difficult work. Because this work was here long before the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. And it requires a lot of dedication to continue because the work is still here for us to do. If you are new to this work, this is no time to step back. Again, we need to bridge gaps in conversation and develop sustainable, impactful next steps. I'm honored to speak with Dr. Livingston, and together I hope we will guide you in taking more intentional anti-racism work. Dr. Livingston's model for change management closely aligns with ours here at YWBoston. As he explains in his book, we as individuals all need to do our part to move the collective forward. As part of our LeadBoston program, we develop mid to senior level executives into more inclusive leaders so that they can help drive this necessary change work within their organizations. And much more can be accomplished when an entire organization commits to institutional change. Our InclusionBoston partners with workplaces to build the trust and understanding needed to hold open discussions about race and develop data-oriented action plans. I hope that following this event, you'll be empowered to take further steps as an individual and as part of an organization. Now, during our conversation, I invite you to add your questions to the Q&A area on the right side of your screen. And now please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Livingston for this discussion. So good to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I answered this question a little bit in my intro, but I'm going to ask you, why did you decide to name it The Conversation? Since I don't want to ruin it, I hope this isn't a spoiler for folks who haven't yet read it. This is not just one conversation. In fact, it's both conversations we should have internally with ourselves and with others. So why the title?
I think the title is an ode to conversation, metaphorically speaking, and more symbolically and abstractly as a form of human connection. And that's based in the literature and the data that shows that facts often fall flat when people are given just data. Social relationships serve as a portal for facts to enter, for people to receive them, and for them to be digested. So let me give you one example of a study that showed this, actually using a nonprofit organization. A group of volunteers at the Red Cross that the organization was interested in getting to serve more organ meat, heart, kidneys, livers, that they weren't serving for a number of reasons. And so they embarked on an informational campaign, basically educating these volunteers about the nutritional benefits of serving organ meat, that it's nutritious, and also the economic benefits, that it would save money. This was post-World War II, when there were lots of food shortages. So they made a very strong persuasive appeal based on information. That was one group. In another group, they gave them the same information. The only difference is they also gave them an hour to talk about it. So in one group, you just have information. The other group, you have information plus conversation. What they were interested in measuring was how many of these women would start serving organ meat on the menu, heart, liver, kidneys. So in both cases, the number currently serving organ meat was 0%. In the condition where they got information, that increased to 3%. So there was some movement in just giving people facts about why they should be doing it. But in the condition where they got information and they got to talk about it, the number of people who started serving organ meat increased to 32%, so more than tenfold. So there was something, and just to give you another personal example, I actually did a training with a group of police officers, and I gave them lots of data from the four corners of the universe, right? I thought making a really strong case for systemic racism and the fact that it existed. And they sort of looked at me politely, but I could tell they weren't currently, completely convinced. It wasn't until the one Black officer on the force broke down in tears and started telling his story about the discrimination that he actually faced that all the officers began to then become convinced that racism was real. And in many ways, in my mind, I thought, this is profoundly unscientific. One story, one anecdote tells us nothing about the world. And I'm telling you, a lot of data that basically covers lots of different bases, convergent validity. We did it yesterday. We did it 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. Here's all the findings. But it takes that one story. And it finally clicked to me that humans are not computers. We are not data processors that just take input and register it. People respond to people, and that human element has to be present in order to move people towards action. And rather than resist that, I embrace that, hence the title of the conversation.
Thank you. And that makes me think, I often say one of the special pieces to our Inclusion Boston program is that dialogue and conversation and getting people to hear others' experience, because that's part of it. And as you were talking, you made me think about a part of the book where you talked about the difference between empathy and sympathy. And I was wondering if you can share a little bit with our audience today, the difference between the two and why that matters.
Mm-hmm. So a similarity between the two is that they both involve emotions, but it's a very different type of emotion, and it's a very different level of identity. So if misfortune befalls another person and I respond with sympathy, then I feel pity for that person. I feel sorrow, I feel sadness, but I'm not actually identifying with the experience that the person has endured. If I experience empathy, then I'm actually experiencing the emotions parallel to the other person. So if they're outraged, then I feel outraged. I don't feel pity for them for having experienced discrimination, for example. I actually feel the same moral outrage that they're experiencing because it's as if the discrimination had happened to me. And so empathy involves a more profound level of perspective taking where you're able to put yourself in that person's shoes and experience what they're experiencing. And empathy is important because it's a greater motivator for action. When you respond as if it happened to you, that produces more solidarity. If you're responding reactively, where you're saying, oh, I'm sorry that happened to you, but, subtext, but it didn't happen to me, then that's going to be a less unifying force. And so I think it's important to try to move people from mere sympathy to empathy, because I think empathy is more instrumental to pushing us towards change when people begin to empathize with the suffering of others and not merely sympathize.
And talking about change, one of the things that I'd love to get your thoughts on, what are the steps, or what is the biggest step that people often skip in this process of trying to get to change? And you've laid out in the book sort of 3 different ways to think about it: the condition, the concern, and then the correction. What's the step that people often skip or don't give enough attention to?
I think they skip all the steps before correction, which is a huge problem. They want to jump right to the solutions without understanding the problem. Let me give you a simple metaphor to explain this. It's as if you walk into the doctor's office with an illness, right? So you've got a problem, and you tell your physician, just give me some medicine. And they say, well, first I've got to listen to your heart. We've got to run some blood tests. And you say, no, we don't need to do any of those diagnoses. Just give me some pills, some pain pills. I'm in pain. No self-respecting physician would ever do that. They would not issue a prescription without understanding the nature of your condition. But we often rush in, as managers, as leaders, as organizations, to jump straight to the prescriptive phase or the problem solving or the solution without really understanding the problem. Albert Einstein once said that if he had 1 hour to solve the world's biggest problem, he would spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem, and that would yield a solution in 5 minutes. I think people want to do the opposite. They want to spend 2 seconds thinking about the problem and then, 59 minutes and 58 seconds on the solution. And I think that's why we see recurring problems, because there hasn't been a diagnosis. It would be similar to, you going in with a headache and just telling the doctor, give me some pills, and they haven't diagnosed you, and what's really causing the headache is dehydration. And so it's going to recur, and you're going to keep needing the pills because you're not drinking enough fluids, because there wasn't a thorough enough diagnosis of what was causing the problem in the first place. So I would say there are 3 steps that need to happen before you get to the solution. First is there a problem? And I know that seems obvious, but it often is the most skipped step. Many people in organizations don't believe that there's a problem. So more specifically, there are many employees who don't believe that racism is a real thing. And so if you create diversity initiatives, they're going to see those as the problem because they're fixing something that doesn't exist. Therefore, they're creating reverse discrimination. So I think it's very important to raise people's awareness that there is, in fact, a problem. That's necessary, but not sufficient. The next step is root cause analysis. Do we know what's causing the problem? Sometimes someone can be sick and not know it. If you have latent cancer, you don't know there's a problem. But sometimes people can have symptoms, and so they know that there's a problem, and the next step is diagnosing where the problem is coming from. And then the third step is that empathy that I talked about before, which is having sufficient concern and motivation to solve the problem. Sometimes people don't care about the problem. There are people out there that don't care about climate change. There are people out there that don't care about racism. They know it exists and they may know where it comes from, but they simply don't care because they don't think it affects them. So I think you need all 3 of those things sort of pinned down before you can get to profound and sustainable solutions and strategies.
would sound from one of your examples that, it's not necessarily a third, but it might be you're spending more time on the first two parts before you get to the actual solution, although the implementation and the sustaining of the solution may take a long time.
Yeah, so I'll give you a personal example. Before I came to Harvard, I was teaching at a university in England, and for a lot of reasons, I didn't drive in England, couldn't get the knack of driving on the left. I did a lot of walking and riding my bike everywhere. The portion sizes are smaller. So I lost about 40 pounds when I lived over there, which was good because I was about 40 pounds overweight or 45 pounds overweight, but I got down to a normal weight. When I came back to Boston, I gained it all and then some. First problem was I didn't realize that I had gained all that weight because I put it on so gradually. It was about a pound a week for several months. And it took someone who hadn't seen me for almost a year to say, whoa, you've grown a lot since the last time I saw you. Root cause analysis. Do I know what was causing it? Yes. Eating too much and not exercising enough, basically. Did I care? Because sometimes, when you're a little overweight, I don't care. If it doesn't interfere with my health, if it doesn't, I say, okay, it's not such a big deal. But I did care in this reason. So I was invested in solving the problem. Beth, the strategy is the simplest. There's no shortage of strategies that actually work for losing weight. There's no shortage of diets. There's no shortage of gyms within a 3-block radius of my home. Like, that is not the hard part. What then determines whether I actually lose the weight is the 5th stage, which is what I call sacrifice, which is not, do I have a strategy, but am I willing to actually implement it and execute it? Am I willing to invest the time, the effort, the energy? Am I willing to incur the trade-offs? That's the $1 million question. Everyone, wants to say, well, tell me what to do, right? If I want to lose 20 pounds, tell me what to do. Someone can tell me what to do in 30 seconds. Someone can hand me a gym membership and 3 cookbooks in, no time flat. That's the strategy. And it's an effective strategy. It will actually work. But guess what? That's not the most important component of whether I'm actually going to lose the weight. It's everything around the strategy. So I think, ironically, the focus on strategy is not really putting all of the attention where it deserves. It's really all about understanding the root cause. It's about the investment of energy. It's about the concern. It's more about the willingness than the ability. Again, for a solvable problem. For a not solvable problem, it's about, what's the solution. But if a problem's solvable, usually it's around the commitment rather than the actual steps or strategies themselves. That's right.
Something else in your book, Robert, that struck me, and I'm raising this in part because it'll make my mother feel good. So often and I've heard this, I know my aunts have said this to my cousins, we have to work twice as hard to be considered half as good. And if we make a mistake, we're making a mistake for the whole race. And your book talks about some data that proves that. So I'd love for you to share that a little bit, because I'm sure a lot of particularly Black parents, this will resonate with them.
Yeah, so in chapter 6, I think it is, I talk about a phenomenon that's called illusory correlations, which is our brains are wired to pick out information that's distinctive. So imagine you see a poster that's got 100 apples, and 99 of the apples are red, and there's one apple that's green. Your eye will immediately go to the green apple. You don't even have to exert any effort. That's just the way. And so we're sort of wired to pick out distinctive features. So what happens is when individuals are members of a minority group, they become more distinctive. They draw more attention. In most spaces, people of color generally stand out, so people notice them more. What ends up happening is when behaviors are distinctive, so, and by the way, negative behaviors stand out more than positive behaviors. It's something called a negativity bias. And so we're more wired to respond to negative things versus positive things. And it's a survival strategy, because when we're out roaming the savannah as prehistoric humans, if you miss the tree full of juicy, fruit, okay, that's too bad. You missed a meal, but you can eat the next day or the next day. But if you miss the lion lurking in the bush, then game over. There is no next day. So you have to be more attentive to negative information versus positive information. The Differential impact is disproportionate, that negative information can affect you a lot more than positive. So what ends up happening, this fact that we are cued into negative information more and we're cued to distinctive cues more, causes people to form a correlation between distinctiveness and negativity. And I explain this much more clearly in the book in several pages, so I'm doing this very quickly now. So what ends up happening is, and there have been studies that show that if you have a Black person and a white person, or a group of Black people and a group of white people, commit the same percentage of negative behaviors, people are still more likely to form that association between Black and negative versus white and negative. Even if you use fictional creatures like Smurfs, if you create a situation where the green Smurfs are in the minority and the blue Smurfs are in the majority or whatever, you get the same effect. So it's not just about the history of Blacks and whites. They've actually done it in studies where they create fictitious creatures that don't even exist, but they have a different numerical representation. And people are more likely to form negative impressions of whoever's in the minority when they do a negative behavior versus whoever's in the majority and they do a negative behavior, even if the percentage of negative behaviors is exactly the same. So that's a phenomenon known as an illusory correlation. Illusory because the correlation is not real, but people actually think that it's real. So what this means is it puts a burden on people of color because you can never be an individual. Because you're distinctive, you are always seen as a representative of a larger group, and people always interpret your behavior in the context of that group. And we've seen many real-world examples of this in the US. So the Vegas shooter, for example, who killed over 50 people in Las Vegas at a country music concert, he was just an individual. No one talked about banning white men from the country the way that they've talked about banning Muslims if incidents involve one of them, because it's not reflective of white men, it's reflective of that individual. And in fact, there was a lot of questions. Well, was he having problems at home? Did he have mental health issues? There were a lot of individual-based explanations. There weren't group-based explanations, despite the fact that most of the perpetrators of mass murders are white males. Like, that's just the data. But they still are not perceived as a group when these kinds of things happen. They still maintain the individuality. And that's not true of people of color. And, it's one of the things that leads to the perpetuation of stereotypes and of biases that have nothing to do with the factual. And people think that it's based on the factual percentages or likelihood that this group will do X or Y. But we've got lots of data that shows that it's not tied to the factual likelihood at all. It's just tied to the fact that distinctive information tends to stand out more, and people remember that trait more when it's a distinctive trait versus when it's not a distinctive trait.
So what can we do? What can organizations do so Black people don't have to work so hard?
Well, that's $1 million question, right? If I could answer that, I'd be in, Oslo accepting a Nobel Prize. But, but one of the things that you can do, and it goes back to my motto, is be aware of it. Because most people are not even aware of it. They will swear up and down that, Muslims are much more likely to be people who perpetrate, mass casualties, despite the data, right? And so I think part of it is to be aware of these biases and to check the biases by actually looking at the data. And I think the second thing is to counteract the biases intentionally, right? The third thing that we find is actually using what we call objective measures versus subjective measures. So when you're doing performance appraisals, if you just rely on your memory, then that's going to have bias built in, because the things that stand out in your memory are going to be the objective things. So you're going to form a more negative impression. But if you keep tallies, like an actual, how many times did that person, make a mistake in their accounting, boom, 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 boom. And then you go back and look at that, then you can see, oh, well, Beth made 5 mistakes, but Emily actually made 8 mistakes. But in my mind, it seemed like Beth made more mistakes than Emily. But you actually have the objective data that you've recorded that can counteract your subjective perceptions. So there's a paper on that about keeping objective data versus subjective data.
5 mistakes, Robert. It might have been 3, but it wasn't 5.
My own bias.
So one thing that I also want to get your thoughts on is, for us as an organization, it's really important to think about the intersection of other identities. And so how can organizations, because often when we work with organizations, they'll focus on, let's look at all people of color, let's look at all women, and not think about what are the intersections. And so how do you get organizations and support them to think about how these intersections can really matter?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I want to be clear that there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off between precision and parsimony, right? So often, when you start to look at all these intersections, you lose a certain amount of simplicity, which means it becomes more complicated. Instead of writing a 2-page report, it's now a 200-page report, right? Because you've gotten into the weeds. And many times people will scratch their heads and say, huh? Like, I don't understand now, or 200. So there's a certain value to simplicity or parsimony. Having said that, you lose a certain amount of nuance and precision. And so I think what the organization has to wrestle with is coming up with an optimal balance so that you're not so crude that you've misrepresented reality, and you're not so precise that you've gotten so deep in the weeds that now no one can follow what you're saying. So the way that I would kind of optimize that is by looking at the intersection of 2 different categories. So let's say race and gender, for example, because that's manageable. Then you got to, 2 by 2, race by gender. But if you look at race by gender, by class, by age, by sexuality, then you're getting like, 50 or 60 different categories, and no one can sort of understand what's all there. Having said that, so I've done research where we've looked at race and gender simultaneously. And the results showed that, for example, white women and Black women are treated very differently, and even Black men and Black women are treated very differently. And these intersectional lenses give us insight into important nuanced differences in the nature of social disadvantage. So it's true that white women, and Black men are all socially disadvantaged relative to white men. But the deeper truth is that they're socially disadvantaged in distinct ways. And I actually call those stigmatization versus subordination versus marginalization. And I'll quickly explain what those mean. Black men are stigmatized, which means they stick out. You notice them in a negative way. White women tend to be subordinated, which means there's not negativity, but there's a power differential. So it's almost like the relationship between parents and children, right? Parents don't hate their children, but they don't feel that children should have the same amount of executive authority as the parents, at least in most households. Or owners and their pets. They don't feel that the dogs should be determining, but again, some pet owners, the dogs own the house. But in most cases, there is a difference in authority. So for sexism, at least sexism against white women, it's not about hatred. It's about power and the role that women should assume relative to men and who should wear the pants, right? As long as women assume a subordinate role, then men will provide affection and protection. They even like women more than they like men. The question is whether men respect women the same that they respect men. So that's subordination, is I should be here and here, almost like a manager-employee relationship. And then the third is marginalization, which is we just don't care about you. You're invisible. You don't exist. So you mentioned opening the session today, Native Americans. That's a marginalized group. It's not a stigmatized group because there aren't enough of the group to even represent a threat. It's a group that's invisible, that's sort of cast off into the shadows that no one sees. And that's the role that Black women occupy. Why? Because they don't represent the same threat to white male patriarchy that Black men do, because Black men are seen as rivals. They're seen as barbarians at the gate. Literally, there's the barbaric image. In other words, Black men are perceived as having a lot of power, but not necessarily being deserving of that power. So they're seen as a threat. White women are interdependent with white men. So they have to get along with them, right? So the question is working out who's going to be in power and who's not going to be in power, because they have to live together. But Black women have neither the interdependence nor the threat, and so they are marginalized. And I talk about the difference between stigmatization, subordination, and marginalization in terms of the impact that it has on leaders as a result of those three different forms of social disadvantage. Because the bottom line is the situation for Black women ends up not being the same as the situation for Black men or white women because of this difference between marginalization, subordination, and stigmatization.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to question before I open up to Q&A. So if you could have this conversation with anybody, either, dead or alive, who would you want to have the conversation with?
Well, since you said dead or alive, I'm going to choose someone dead, and I would say Abraham Lincoln. I would go back in time and fast forward, 150 years later and say, you got to do this differently. There need to be different structures and things in place. And I think you can't be as lenient as you're being on certain forces that are hell-bent on keeping this social hierarchy intact. And here's how we should do this.